Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you for another thoughtful discussion. Books and Bridges is a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We act on the belief that sincere, searching dialogue across the human spectrum can bring beauty and depth to our public interactions. Tonight, we go back to the beginnings of the civil rights movement and explore the spiritual roots of nonviolent civil disobedience that changed American history. Politics often rests upon a moral foundation, and the writings of Howard Thurman reveal a Jesus far more reproachful of majority complacency than we are comfortable to acknowledge. History's societal hegemonies, by definition, serve the interests of the powerful. But Christianity inverts that order and empowers people whose backs are against the wall to cast fear aside and rise to their spiritual inheritance. We are honored to have Teddy Reeves with us tonight. Dr. Reeves earned his BA from Hampton University, his MDiv from Princeton Seminary, and Ph.D. from Fordham University. His scholarship and praxis can be found at the intersections of entertainment, faith, and spirituality, digital media, art, fashion, and culture. Teddy currently serves as a curator of religion at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. In 2018, he created a web-based talk show series entitled God Talk, a Black Millennials and Faith Conversation series, which explores the dynamic ways Black millennials are engaging with faith in the 21st century. So take it away, Dr. Reeves, the floor is yours. So grateful for you joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nathan, for the invitation. So glad to be here. Glad to be with those who are in the space, sharing the space with us. I am, by trade, I am an educator. I am a teacher. And I'm also a preacher in the Black Baptist Church. So I love call and response. I love it talking back. Tonight for me is a conversation, and really, as Nathan has so beautifully done, set up a space for dialogue and thoughtful dialogue. And so I'm excited to jump in and talk more about Howard Thurman, the theologian, the mystic, the prophet, Howard Thurman, who was influential in my own theological development and formation during my time in seminary. And so again, thank you so much, Nathan, for this time. And I'm going to share my screen. And I want to make sure, as I got sound to share with you all. So I think we're all good to go. And
that's good.
Awesome. I entitled this time Contextualizing Thurman, because I think it's important to talk about Thurman in context. And for those of you who may be familiar with Thurman and those of you who are coming to Thurman tonight for the first time, or you've heard about him, but you don't know much about him, I really wanted to contextualize him and give some background foundational knowledge, because Thurman comes about not in a vacuum. Thurman theology is formed by his upbringing, by his experiences that he has, by what's going on in the life of African-American people at that time. So in grounding, this first part in grounding Thurman, Thurman is born November 8th, 1899, at the turn of the 20th century. Thurman enters the world. African-American people have, the Emancipation Proclamation has been passed for some 20, going on 30 something years at this point. Thurman enters the world and is the grandchild of formerly enslaved African-Americans. And so again, contextualizing and grounding Thurman, we understand what formed him. His grandmother was an enslaved woman. And so Thurman is born in Daytona Beach, Florida. He goes on to attend Morehouse College in Atlanta, the all-male African-American college in Atlanta, and then goes from there, gets a BA in economics, and enrolls in divinity school at Colgate Rochester Divinity School, where he receives, at that time, a bachelor's of divinity degree. Thurman is an ordained minister in the Baptist tradition. He serves as both pastor and professor in many different capacities over the tenure of his professional life. He serves as a professor of religion at Spelman College, which is the all-women's college next to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, and Morehouse, respectively. At the same time, he holds dual appointment. He goes on to serve at Howard University Divinity School as a professor, and then becomes the chaplain of Rankin Chapel at Howard, which is a prestigious position, and becomes the first dean of chapel at Rankin, which is Howard University is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. Another pivotal moment for Thurman is that Thurman goes on to help co-found the Church of the Fellowship of All People, which at the time of its founding is radical in and of itself. It is the first interracial, interdenominational church in the US at that time. So Thurman has people of all different faith traditions worshiping, all different creeds and colors worshiping in the same space in San Francisco, which is radical in and of itself, right? There's two pastors at this community. This community is still in existence. If you can make your way to San Francisco, which I just actually left San Francisco 2 days ago, the church is still up and thriving. And he also, again, from there goes to Boston University. He becomes the first African-American chaplain at any predominantly white institution in the United States, and becomes dean of the chapel at Boston University, where you can find majority of Thurman's papers and artifacts related to Thurman are at Boston University. Again, if you want to do more research after this conversation, the Thurman papers are at Boston, and again, the Church of the Fellowship of All People, but really wanted to ground Thurman. Thurman is a theologian. Thurman is a religious man. Thurman is a pastor and a professor. Thurman, again, is the descendant of an enslaved woman and grandmother and grandfather, right? This is the world in which Thurman is entering. This is the world that Thurman is reared. This is the world that influences Thurman's questions and his theology. So one of the most pivotal points for Thurman, right? He goes and he accomplishes many different things. Like I said, he attends Morehouse. He's a professor. He does all these other things. But what really began to shift and what really radically shifted Thurman's theology is his time in India. And to the right is a picture of Thurman and his wife, Sue Bailey, which is Sue Bailey Thurman, pardon me, who is renowned in her own right. I encourage you to go research Sue Bailey. She is heavy in the fight for women's rights and Black women's rights, and an activist in her own right. But this is an image of them in India. So Thurman goes to India, takes a delegation to India for individuals to Myanmar and Sri Lanka. And this pilgrimage is called the Pilgrimage of Friendship, right? He's going as an invitation sponsored by the Student Christian Movement in India, and sponsored by organization here in the US. Thurman has a lot of questions, right? So Thurman is going to India. At the time, he becomes the first African-American to meet with Mahatma Gandhi. He is the first African-American to take a pilgrimage over to India, and taking this group, he's going with some fundamental questions about the life of African-American people in the US, right? Wrestling with the systemic issues of racism, the systemic issues of violence being enacted on Black bodies that he had grown up with and that he was currently experiencing, right? This is pre the civil rights movements of the 50s and the 60s. Thurman has a lot of questions. He has questions about nonviolence. He has questions about Mahatma Gandhi's movement, right? That how was he able to do the work that he was doing in the face of opposition, in the face as a marginalized person? How was he able to do this work? So Thurman and others spoke to Gandhi about nonviolence and the concept of ahimsa, which is a Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism concept of nonviolence, right? So it's near the end of Thurman's trip. He's there for almost a year. It's at the end of his trip that he gets to speak to Gandhi, him and those who came with him. And a quintessential question that Gandhi asked Thurman, which it always or states about the American Negro, but it's a question that he also asked Thurman, which I'll play in a few minutes, What he stated was, it may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence would be delivered to the world, right? Gandhi had some questions about African-American people and their allegiance to the Christian church, because Gandhi is like, it's the Christian church that enslaved you. It's the Christian church and the masters that begin to enact the horrors of chattel slavery and violence against your body. Gandhi asked the question, how can the American Negro at that time, the language that was used at that time, be so connected and tied to the Christian church? And so I want to show and play for you just a piece of Thurman in his own words. I always think it's important to let people speak for themselves if you can, and that's the beauty of digital technology, as he talks about meeting Gandhi.
He began asking questions, all kinds of questions about Negro life, about democracy in the United States, about education, public education, private education, churches, the whole gamut of things. And then one of the things that puzzled him about our people was the fact that we had become Christians.
Puzzled as to why the black people became Christian.
Yes, because he said the only religion in the world, and he emphasized the fact that I speak as a Hindu, the only religion in the world in which there is no difference once you are in the faith is the Muslim religion. And therefore it would be a natural thing for the slaves to become Muslim. But you became Christians, and you had a disadvantage if you were praying to your master's God. And he went into that in great detail. Of course, it's a very familiar story. At the end of the questions to him, he apologized because he'd taken all the time, and he wondered whether or not we had some questions
To put to him.
Which was just the reverse of everything, because people who came to see him came to ply him with questions. And Mrs. Thurman had a question to ask him about his policy or his philosophy of nonviolence. How would that operate in America? And I had one or two questions to ask him. And then he said, now, just before you go, I want to ask you to do me a favor. And I said, oh, anything. And he said, will you sing a song? And I said, I don't sing, but I'll certainly try for you if I know the song. But Mrs. Thurman is a musician. Perhaps she can do it. He said, it's one of your own songs. And I said, which one is it? And he said, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Because, he said, I think that song, in essence, provides the meeting place where all of the human suffering and misery is touched by something that lifts it and redeems it and makes it whole. So we stood in this bungalow tent in a large field, and we sang this song while Gandhiji and his little group sat in prayer like this. When it was over, there was a long silence, seemed like 1,000 years. And then he prayed a prayer in his own language. He began asking questions.
So in this, you hear Thurman talking about Gandhi and his question around the American Negro and their allegiance to the Christian church. You hear him talking about Gandhi's question or asking to have, were you there when they crucified my Lord, sung, right? And so Thurman leaves India deeply concerned about Jesus, right? Deeply concerned about the theology that we had created around the Christ. Leaving India deeply wrestling with several questions around the marginalized and those who find, as Thurman uses in Jesus and the Disinherited, those who find their backs up against the wall, those who are the marginalized in the world in which we live. And for Thurman, those were people of African descent and others who find themselves in that place where in this system then and also within that system now. And so Thurman comes back really trying to better understand this question of the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus, right? Which are two different things, right? The religion of Jesus is what Thurman was really trying to figure out and trying to ground much of his work on, versus the religion about Jesus, right? That this thing that had been constructed about this Christ figure, this poor Jewish man, and how it had been used to indoctrinate and enslave and to chastise and to oppress individuals within the society. And so Thurman is seriously doing the work and concerned about how Jesus's ministry and how Jesus's life could be redemptive for people of African descent, but also redemptive for those who found themselves as oppressors, right? That Thurman is concerned about both. And so again, as I'm kind of just laying this groundwork for Thurman and giving you some background, Thurman published more than 15 books and numerous articles and several lectures during his lifetime. 1945, he does Deep River. 1947, Negro Spiritual speaks of life and death. Jesus and the Disinherited comes out in 1949, The Inward Journey. Thurman is extremely concerned about the inward life, right? He's deeply concerned about what's going on internally, right? That if you can do the work internally, it flows out and it flows back in. And it's all about, and he grows into this work, this constant work of finding self and doing the work of self to not allow exterior things to move you. And I'll get into that when he talks about fear and when he talks about hatred and all of those other, what he calls the three hounds of hell, right? That this work, particularly in Jesus and the Disinherited. And then with Head and Heart, the autobiography of Howard Thurman, he writes his autobiography in 1979. And again, the central question for Jesus and the Disinherited is, what does the religion of Jesus offer to those with their backs up against the wall? Right? How is Jesus relevant? How is Jesus redemptive? How is Jesus affirming? How is Jesus salvific in the tangible way for helping those with their backs up against the wall? For Thurman, it was not necessarily about the worshiping of Jesus, but more so Thurman is concerned about how the story of Jesus and how this life of this poor Jewish man at that time who was living with his back up against the wall and those in community with him and those like him, how was his ministry and the work that he did able to help African Americans at that time in the United States, but also to help others as the nonviolent movement was helping Gandhi and others around the world. So individuals who live with their backs up against the wall are pursued in Jesus and the Disinherited. What Thurman says is that individuals who live with their backs up against the wall are pursued by three hounds of hell. And those hounds of hell are fear, deception, hypocrisy, and hatred, right? These things Thurman believes pursues the individual who is finding themselves oppressed, right? And can keep that individual from doing the work necessary to get to the point of fighting for the right in the system, right? That does the work necessary to speak up and speak truth to the oppressor, the necessary work to liberate oneself. And a little later, I'll show a clip where it talks about Thurman. Walter Fluker is really talking about Thurman's work and how he sees the marginalized as doing God's work on earth, right? So for Thurman, these three hounds of hell keep the oppressed from reaching this point of nonviolence, from reaching this part of doing the inner work, and from reaching this part of speaking truth to those who may be oppressing them in a nonviolent way. So in the work, in speaking about Christ, and I'm just going to read the kind of the highlight bolded, and I'll talk through them. Thurman recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life, again, not as inclusive in language at the time, but his or her inner life, gives into the hands of the other the keys to his destiny. Again, for Thurman, again, this inner work, that it is the work of the individual to do. And again, talking about Christ and using Christ as an example, to not allow these external threats to come in and to seep in and to overtake one, to lead towards violence, right? He meets with Gandhi and sees and really believes that Christ's ministry and Christ's work could be, and really taught that. And what we see in the civil rights movement, what I'll talk about a little later, is that it was in many ways, right? That this work leads to nonviolence and leads to the freedom of a people, right? And so he really believes this inner work, right? That if you do the work of the inner soul, if you do the work of the inner man and woman to deconstruct hate and all those other things, that you won't allow it to dictate your actions and will not lead you to violence. Thurman believed wherever the spirit of Jesus, again, right, Jesus for him was not about adoration and worship. It was about the spirit and the work and the life. Wherever the spirit of Jesus appears, the oppressed gather fresh courage. For he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, need have no dominion over them, right? That when the oppressed find the work of Jesus, right, the nonviolent work of Jesus, the work to speak against power and principalities and to speak for the other marginalized and oppressed community, when one finds and takes up this spirit and operates in this spirit, those that are around you, the hounds of hell of fear and hatred and hypocrisy, will not overtake you. But Thurman believes that this does not happen in a vacuum, right? That for one to do this work, particularly those who are leading the civil rights movement, for those who are leading movements of that day, prayer, meditation, silence, contemplation was important for Thurman in one cultivating this spiritual discipline, and one being able to fight off the fear, to fight off the hypocrisy, to fight off the hatred, right? That this internal work, again, this is still putting ownership not only on the oppressed, but also this was work that the oppressed must do as the oppressor must do as well. Thurman also grounded his work in love, right? Through love and the commitment of nonviolence, one can create the possibility of community. And Walter, I'm gonna show a clip of Walter Fluker really talking about this community that Thurman was trying to get us to, this, as Fluker says, this democratic space that Thurman was pushing towards, that one must be on the same footing as those who are oppressing them. So I want to play this clip from Walter Fluker, who is a renowned Thurman scholar, professor at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia, talking about Thurman. He was a student of Thurman's. He sat in Thurman's class. And so he talks about this experience, but also gives a very practical way to see this work that Thurman and these teachings that Thurman was trying to ground in Jesus and the Disinherited, in his inward work, and his subsequent work after that.
And left out. When I first met Thurman years ago at a seminar, it wasn't the first time I met him, but I attended a seminar in the late 70s entitled Footprints of the Disinherited. And he told a story that morning. He was so funny. There were only 10 of us. And he opened like the wise old sage that he was. He said, you know, there's a place somewhere in Montana. I don't know if you've ever been to Montana. There we are, all students. He said, but they have all of these hills and they raise cattle. And there's some kind of cattle there. And he fumbled with the words, but he was playing with us now like a cat that has found his prey. And he says, they were Black Angus or something. And I noticed that the bulls always gathered together. And there was a young calf a young bull, but a calf, who tried to enter the herd, but they never let him in. He said, I never could understand that. Then he said there was another place where they had mountain peaks, only 3 of them. And for some reason, the lightning would only strike one of the peaks. And there we were, just puzzled. And of course, Thurman was trying to help us understand the disposition of the marginalized and how it's often that God takes the marginalized to do God's work. It's no accident, and Thurman loved this scripture, the stones that the builders rejected have become the head of the corner, and it's marvelous in God's eyes, so, and our eyes. Part of the work, again, and its applicability, I think, is to begin to think about the very important places where those who have not been allowed to share in the promises for Thurman of democracy, to share democratic space with others, with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto. And there are a host of bodies that collect there. I think one of the ways to read it is, how do we create democratic space? And Jesus becomes, for Thurman, the exemplar of how this gets done. This gets done, he says, by first overcoming fear. Fear is something that is internalized. We have the language of trauma, but it's a wound that bleeds. And we are often so afraid on all sides of the equation that it's very difficult to get to see the other and to be with the other and share space. And we must overcome, he says, deception. That is, lying to one another. And he places, I think, and sometimes my students think, maybe an inordinate burden on the oppressed to always tell the truth to the oppressor. But Thurman says you can never be equal with your oppressor until you destroy all vestiges of deceit, because only then does he recognize you as for real when you speak truth and live the truth. So you equalize, and then of course, overcoming hate, and finally, as you said, embracing the love ethic, embodying that ethic. He thinks that's the way we create democratic space, and citizenship is then left out.
So Walter Fluker so excellently really sums up a lot of that work that Thurman was trying to do around that, and around the work and again, the work of Christ, right? That Thurman is a theologian who's grounded in the work, in the redemptive work of the Christ. And so when I want to talk about the influence of Thurman, right? This time was really to talk about, I wanted to ground Thurman, but also talk about the influence that Thurman had on the civil rights movement. And I want to read this quote from Thurman. "It was my conviction and determination that the church would be a resource for activists, a mission fundamentally perceived. To me, it was important that the individual who was in the thick of the struggle for social change would be able to find renewal and fresh courage in the spiritual resources of the church. There must be provided a place, a moment when a person could declare, 'I choose.'" Right. So Thurman, again, in the height of the civil rights movement, sees himself as a spiritual advisor, as those who participated in the movement and have been interviewed talk about Thurman being a father figure of the movement, right? That he saw his work not necessarily on the picket lines and not necessarily in the sit-ins, but he saw himself as this wisdom sage that those leaders could come to, that those leaders could find respite in, that those leaders could be renewed by conversations with Thurman, strategization with Thurman. And Thurman is not necessarily sitting lawfully in the academy or not sitting lawfully in his church pews, but he is doing the work that he feels necessary, another part of the work of the movement. So the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, that is synonymous with King, pardon me, but you have Marion Wright Edelman, you have Jesse Jackson, you have Nannie Helen Burroughs, right? All of these individuals find refuge and more with Howard Thurman, right? Thurman becomes a mentor and a sage to all of them. If you go look throughout the Thurman papers at Boston, you can see correspondence that Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. had. They actually only was in each other's space physically twice. Once King comes to Thurman's home, he's still a student at Boston University. He's a doctoral student, and they're watching the World Series. King and Sue Bailey Thurman are in the kitchen area having a conversation. King is seriously considering going to the church in San Francisco to work. But what Sue and Thurman's writings show is that King has a strong yearning and calling to get back to Montgomery, right? And we know eventually what that calling and that yearning was for, right? That he was seriously considering going after he finished his doctoral work out there, but that this call, this yearning, this desire was to Montgomery, was to the struggle that was happening in the South. Thurman sends a book to Curator and King. He sends the Deep Rivers book. I believe it's the Deep Rivers or the Life and Death. I cannot recall at the top of my head right now, but he sends a book to them. But I wanted to put this quote. It says, "To the kings, the test of life is often found in the amount of pain we can absorb without spoiling our joy." Right? That's powerful in and of itself when he talks about hatred, when Thurman is grounding his work on hatred and the three hounds of hell, that all of the pain that comes, that we can absorb it without spoiling our joy, right? We don't allow it to overtake us to the point of death. We don't allow it to overtake us to the point of violence, that we absorb it. Now, there will be modern critiques to that today, right? That some would say that this is, why should the oppressed have to absorb it, right? I want to contextualize that too, that Thurman was not writing in a vacuum. You had those who were not in agreement with the nonviolent movement, most noticeably Malcolm X and others at that time who were not in line with nonviolence as a way forward. But Thurman really grounds his work in this example of Christ, that there is a way to move forward the work, right? There is a way to create common ground in the language that Thurman would use, which for Thurman is community, right? That we can create this democratic community where we can acknowledge one another, that we can acknowledge that we all are running from these hounds of hell, that we're all trying to see each other. But I think what's important also that Fluker really highlights is that Thurman, in many ways, is seeing that the work of Christ, the work of God in the earth could be done through those who are oppressed. That's an interesting place to rest. It's an interesting place to nuance, that God shows up, that God manifested on the earth is with the oppressed, right? That God's work happens through the oppressed. So what does that say about the oppressed? Right, that those are questions that, for me, as I read Thurman some 10 years ago in seminary, and have gone back to Thurman at different points in my own personal journeys, particularly when violence happens against Black bodies, right? That Thurman becomes a place for me, a place of refuge that I can often go back to and say, if God is doing God's work through the oppressed, right? How do we live in a place, for me now as a theologian, how do I create space for nonviolence? How do I create space for the redemptive work of Christ? How do I create space? How do I constantly interrogate the life of Christ, the religion of Jesus, and the religion about Jesus? How do I continuously, because part of that is also interrogating system and empire, right? That the life and doing the work of both. I'm going to move on because I know I want to get some questions from you all. The next piece that I wanted to show you, and I won't play the video just for the sake of time. I'll go on to the next thing. But when King and the civil rights movement is happening, again, Thurman is living. Thurman dies in 1981. So Thurman is working, is writing, is mentoring these leaders as they are, these young leaders, right? That these leaders were in their 20s and 30s. Thurman is much older, and he is really playing this role of sage to guide them through the movement. And what I wanted to show in these last two slides is that African-American people remained nonviolent for the most part in this movement, even in the face of violence constantly being enacted on their bodies. And I think that that's always important to talk about. It's always important to ground in the work, that this ethic of Christ and this work, this work of trying to find common ground, this work of trying to be seen as human, to be seen as divine, that African-American people remained nonviolent for the most part of this movement, right? It is a religious-based movement. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is religious-based. Unlike movements of today, unlike the Black Lives Matter movement of today, the civil rights movement is birthed out of the Black church, is birthed out of Black religious spaces, is birthed not only out of the Black church, but also in Black Muslim spaces, right? That Malcolm X is not divorced of the movement, these movements are happening at the same time, in connection in many ways as well. And so 16th Street church bombing happens in Birmingham, Alabama. The 4 little girls are killed. King comes to the site of this killing, of this violence that's enacted on these bodies. 19 sticks of dynamite is planted by the KKK outside of the church basement. The museum, we currently own some of the shards of glass. So these are images of some of the shards of glass that we have at the museum, that really talk about the perseverance of African-American people, that talk about our willingness to continue to fight for our basic rights of humanity, to fight to be seen, fight to be heard, and to fight to just exist and just to be. And again, I'm gonna move on to this last one, just highlighting again that this does not happen in a vacuum, that this movement and this moment and this nonviolence that King learns from Thurman. It is said that King traveled with his copy of Jesus and the Disinherited, and he read it often. Jesse Jackson and other movement leaders attest to King constantly going back to Jesus and the Disinherited as this reference point, as this guiding light, as this grounding point. And others, John Lewis and Jesse Jackson and others talked about how that seminal work really grounded their work in nonviolence, right? That you get this from Gandhi, you get this this global movement of nonviolence making its way through the community. But again, I just wanted to highlight another point of violence, right? That the 4 little girls become an impetus of the civil rights movement and really begin to wake up the world and wake up the country, not just Black, but white, when we're talking about common community and talking about truth to power, when 4 children are killed. And then you have Emmett Till, who's 14 years old, who is brutally murdered, who's dumped in the Tallahatchie River, whose killers go to trial, they're acquitted, and then sell their story for $1,000 and admit that they have done it, right? This is all happening as African-American people continue to fight for equality in a nonviolent way, right? Even as violence is enacted on us, we remained nonviolent. And so I wanted to really put those two things there as just some contextualization and really contextualize Thurman, right? That he's living in this world and that his work and his belief in the work of Christ, he believes, and his belief of us telling truth, those who are marginalized, those who find their backs up against the wall, their job is to speak truth to the oppressor, even at the risk of death. And we have examples here. Martin Luther King spoke truth in a nonviolent way to the oppressor, even to the point of death. Medgar Evers spoke truth to the oppressor, even to the point of death. And we have many others who did that. And Thurman felt that that was the work of those who found their backs up against a wall, was to speak truth in love, and this dangerous radical love too. It's a radical love of oneself, because Thurman again is all about the inward work and moving out and how that all is connected, but also this radical love of community and neighbor, right? That taking the scripture to heart. So I'm going to be quiet because I could keep talking about Thurman and the work and contextualizing. Questions? Do we have any questions? I want to open it up for dialogue. And I guess the question that I would pose, and you may have other things to say, is how does Thurman's work help us see the world today? In particular, see the injustices and the individuals who still find their backs up against the wall in this country and abroad. How has Thurman work helped ground our fight moving forward? Who still see themselves today, those who still see themselves with their backs up against the wall. How can Thurman's work and theology ground the work and the movements of today for us to move forward in that work? So yeah, I'll open up. Nate, if you have anything, I welcome that as well.
Well, thank you very much, Teddy. That was a great presentation. I think you laid the groundwork for a further understanding of not only Howard Thurman, but the civil rights movement in general, and Christianity, more broadly speaking. So thank you very much. The thought that I had as I listened to you was just this idea that what you are talking about is really, it's a tale of power. It's a, and what power is, the illusion of power, the paradox of power, what false power can be, and what we might think is power is actually weakness. The power over the body, the power of the mind, but in inversion, power to resist that. And so, I guess my question, just to start this off, is just in Howard Thurman's view, where lieth real power, as opposed to the false power of the hegemony, you might say, or the oppressor?
Yeah. I think for Thurman, the power lied with those who had their backs up against the wall, right? That the power lied with those who were oppressed in that system, right? That yes, this false power lied with those who had this fake power, right? This dominance that they had created and constructed using this story about Jesus, right? Using Christianity and using religion to marginalize and oppress individuals then and also now, that power in their minds resided with them because they controlled the narrative. But the real power, the power to overcome that, the power to speak truth to that, lied with those who found themselves with their backs up against the wall. It lied with those who were in those marginalized spaces, because you saw that you saw that with the civil rights movement, right? That those individuals who did the inward work, not without their own flaws, not perfect, but did that work and remained true to what they believe they had been called to, were able to bring about great change. Now there becomes questions when you're talking about today's movements and previous movements, where people are saying, does it always have to be the responsibility of the oppressed, right? That you lay that burden continuously at the feet of one group. I think for Thurman, though, it also was, Thurman did not just put the blame and the responsibility of those who were oppressed, but he also put equal responsibility for those who found themselves in power, right? That they too had to do the work of overcoming and combating those three hounds of hell as well, right? That they, in doing their own work, and those who oppress doing their own work, that we could find, in Thurman's language, this common ground, right? This higher ground, which is community and democracy and democratic space. So I think it's both, but in deconstructing really that power, it's those who found themselves with their backs up against the wall. And for Thurman, those were African-American people. Also talking about the people in India at that time, but also if we bring it to modern day times, those are individuals who find themselves, whether it's individuals in the LGBTQIA+ community, those who find themselves marginalized because of their gender, those who find themselves marginalized because of their physical abilities, that the power lies with those individuals, because for Thurman, that's God doing God's work. Right. And if God manifests God's self in those individuals and in those spaces, then the power really resides. If God is all powerful, the power resides with those individuals.
Well, feel free to ask questions. Anyone who has a question to ask or a comment to make. I can continue discussing with you, Teddy, about this whole idea of Christianity being a paradox and how, it started out as a small, ragtag group of Jewish people in Judea, fleeing power, trying to make do with a life, under the eye of the Roman Empire, and somehow over about 3 or 4 centuries, maybe 5 or 6, the minority becomes the majority. It becomes power. It adopts secular power, and then in turn, it over the centuries became the vehicle for oppression of the minority. And so what we see is this kind of strange cycle of what would you call it, fluctuating hegemonies, or something like fluctuating roles of power. Where does this stop, and how can we enter a situation where we don't have to view the world in terms of oppressed and oppressor, powerless, powerful? And maybe that's the ultimate vision of Jesus. What do you think?
I mean, that would be, right? That's to use that's kingdom come, right? That is the point that I think we all are striving, or hopefully that we're all striving towards, right? That is a world that we all desire to live in. I think it's a world that Christ pointed towards, right? That this, particularly grounding it in Thurman's work, right? That this life and this work of Christ, that how we get to that point, for Thurman and for other theologians, liberation theologians, and that follow in that tradition is eradicating hate, right? Eradicating the various things that we have used and that have been used to marginalize individuals, to render one invisible, to render one different, to render one less than. But that takes truth, right? That takes bringing, and Thurman talked about this truth, right? The truth, this freedom that comes with truth. That this takes a honest conversation like tonight, right? It takes continuous conversations on national stages, on local spaces, to talk about the role and the ways that religion has been harmful and has been weaponized and used to marginalize and oppress individuals in this country and in other spaces. But also to talk about this the radical nature, particularly thinking about Christianity, that the Christ story gives us, right? That this liberatory power, that this poor Jewish man who comes in, flips tables, is speaking truth to power to overturn religiosity, right? To overturn the ways that religion was oppressing individuals at that time, to tell people that they had the right, that they had that they could find a seat at the table, right? That is the work that I think that we have to continue to do today, right? That we have to continue to tell people that there is enough room at the table, and if we don't have enough room, we build bigger tables, we bring more chairs, right? But that all takes conversation, that all takes truth. And I think that that's what Thurman was really doing in his work, was really laying out the life of Jesus, right? And this work around who was this Jewish man, right? Who was this poor Jewish man? Who was this carpenter? Not the life not the Jesus that had been constructed and given, right? Not the text of slaves obey your masters, not the text that is not talking about the liberatory work that Christ did. Pardon me. And I think that was one of the questions in the chat, was talking about this differentiation between the life of Jesus and the life about Jesus. And so really one is really talking about this constructed life and how Jesus was given to African-American people during enslavement, how Jesus has been given to many folks as oppressive, as not standing on the side of the oppressed, not being the Jesus that was given to folks that they don't know that Jesus was on the side of the oppressed, right? That Jesus was concerned because he found himself in the same space socioeconomically. He found himself in the same space culturally. He's found himself in the same space. And so Thurman is saying that there is a difference, that part of deconstructing and creating really a new theology and a new groundwork is to differentiate the two, right? To know the liberatory power of Jesus, to know the story of Jesus who fed the hungry, to speak about the Jesus who was in the space with the woman who was seen as reputable, to talk about the Jesus who flipped the table in the temple because folks were being mistreated, right? To talk about that Jesus. And to differentiate that Jesus from the Jesus of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Jesus that came to be used as an instrument, perhaps, of not only slavery, but dominion in a governmental sense.
Absolutely.
Or, ostracization.
Mm-hmm.
And this kinds of oppression, ostracization happen on, grand scales of government, or the small scale of a neighborhood or a family, a street. And like you say, I think that the vision of Jesus, the vision of the kingdom of God, ultimately kind of aims towards that condition in which there's no oppression, there's no whom kind of thing. That Vladimir Lenin formulated this idea of whom, like someone has to be in charge over another. Well, that takes work. That takes vision. I mean, and can you get that vision really from a secular point of view, do you think, without religion?
That's an interesting question. As a scholar who looks at particularly millennials and Gen Z and their religion and spiritual lenses and ways in which they are reconstituting faith, it's an interesting question to pose, as many of them are leaving faith traditions, particularly Christianity. And so the question becomes, can that be achieved outside of a Christian space? Only time will tell, right? That the participation of these younger generations, while I think it's always important to qualify, particularly from my stance in doing work around African-American millennials and Gen Zers, they have not left Jesus, they just left the church, right? So that this work could be necessarily done with their widening and expanded scope of Christ and the Christ work. So many of them are following in the line and tradition of Thurman, even if they don't know Thurman, right? That this liberatory power of Christ. But I don't know, right? That I think that time will tell. I think religion and spirituality will always be, for me, an essential part of that fight. And whether it is the dominant voice of the fight, right? We see that again in the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not started in a religious space. It's started by 3 queer Black women. And so we saw change come. Not the church is playing a bystander this time and not necessarily leading a movement. So I think it is possible, right? That we have examples of it being possible. I think the question is, does the church have to lead it? That's the question, right? That religion and spirituality can play a part in bringing about that kingdom. But will the church be at the forefront of that new heaven and new earth? I don't think so. And that becomes, for me, the point that some would agree and some would disagree. But I think with the numbers as they are, and as we're seeing this, I don't think the institutional church will be at the forefront of that new kingdom. I think it's going to be individuals. I think it's going to be young people who are finding and creating new spaces to have conversations about God and the divine, and in their local communities, in their churches, in their mosque, at brunch, with their therapists, right? Like they're creating these spaces not in the traditional way and bringing about this kingdom on large and small scales.
So Amy Hunter has a question to ask. Let me just read the question. With Jesus Christ turning water into wine and the idea of transmutation being expanded into the changing of human behaviors and ultimately human understandings, do you think Thurman believed he was radically learning how to wield godly power in his marginalized community by learning how to transmute darkness into light, untruth into truth, hatred into love, and supposed ignorance into godly power?
I think you answered your question, Amy, and you said it in parentheses. I think so. Absolutely. Right. Like this is the work that Thurman is doing, that he is wielding power in his theology, particularly grounding it with those who have their backs up against the wall. He's finding, and by making that statement in and of itself, it's in some ways earth shattering, right? To say that God's power and God's work and God's hands resides with those who are oppressed to do the work to bring about this new heaven and new earth. How could you possibly, if you find and you believe in this Christ, in this God, how could you possibly want to treat anyone like that? If God yields God's power, if God does the work through these individuals, as we have examples through Christ and that whole lineage, right? You can go through all of it. You can go through John the Baptist. You can go through others where this work is being done at the hands of many who found themselves marginalized and oppressed. It's a powerful thing. So yes, you answered your own question. I'm not going to reiterate it because you answered it. Yeah, I'm in agreement.
Any more questions? I do have a question I was thinking about earlier, and that is about the how broadly can Howard Thurman be forward as a spiritual kind of sage? Could a young professional in Moscow, Russia, or could a father or mother, in Mexico, or could a aspiring young activist in let's say South Korea or Japan, could they glean some of these universalist messages from Howard Thurman outside of this American historical context?
Absolutely, right? He goes to India to do the work, right? To really ground the work that to ground his own theology, right? That he leaves India, and Jesus and the Disinherited and other works come before that, but this book takes years for Thurman to work on, right? That the work and the message and the understanding and people's backs are against the wall all over this world, right? Whether they're in Mexico, in India, in Sri Lanka, in Malta, in London, there will, if you're taking Christ's words, the poor will always be among us, right? That there will always be someone with their backs up against the wall in this system. And so I think Thurman's work is just as relevant to us in this American context as it is to anyone else. I think people can find themselves in the text and can find liberation for themselves and for their people within the text. I think Thurman is just as relevant as he was when his work, when Jesus and the Disinherited and his other work first came out, to he is now, right? That you can read his work. And while the context may change, right? The cultural context, all of those things may change. There are individuals all over this world whose backs are against the wall. And I think that they can find some solace and find, even if it's a point of entry, to begin to do the work of deconstructing, to do the work of building this or calling about or working towards this kingdom in their capacity and in their space. Thurman should be added to the library, right? That Thurman offers, particularly if you are following, I would even argue, even if you're not following the Christ story, if that's not your belief system, there is something there, right? That he goes to learn from a Hindu, right? That this is, he starts an interreligious community, right? Non-denominational, right? You have folks who are Buddhists in his worship community, right? So this work transcends. And I think that's the beauty of Thurman, that he, one, was before his time, and two, that he knew that this fight and this work was beyond Christianity, right? That this work was human work, that this is not Christian or Jew or Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim work. This is human work. And we find ourselves trying to create democracy, to use Thurman, right? This community where we can see each other and recognize each other, and that there's no one above the other. There's no hierarchy in that way, but we are living in community, and constantly in living in community, we are living in truth, we are living in love, and we're living in care for those who are least of these.
In this pluralistic age in which, no longer do we have the luxury of living, homogeneous societies. There are some still, but more and more in this world, we live amongst people who are different from us, who believe differently than us. And that makes human rights, the reciprocity of human rights, that much more important. And this idea that, it's not enough to just protect your rights. You have to protect everyone's rights in order for your own rights to be secure. And so I think Thurman teaches us that majorities and minorities are always in flux. One day's minority might be tomorrow's, majority. And so the safe route, I think, is to kind of live according to what Jesus taught, which is, it's that reciprocity, that mutuality of the golden rule. And if only for that, Thurman will always be very relevant, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see, we have another question. I think this is Annalisa. You mentioned young people leaving churches. From what I gather, much of it is institutional discontent, as you mentioned. What do you imagine Thurman would think of a church being considered an oppressor?
That's a great question, Annalisa. I hope I pronounced your name, Annalisa or Annalise. But that there is, I think if you're using the framework and you're using the language of Thurman and what he was trying to do, absolutely. A lot of what we're seeing, particularly we're in the midst of filming of a God Talk series, really understanding Black millennials and faith, and filming a documentary right now to really go deeper into the faith experiences of Black millennials. But I think in general with millennials, I think that Thurman, and I hate to guess what someone else would think, and they're no longer with us. But I think if I'm using the context and the work that he's left us, I think that Thurman would critique this church, would critique the church that we have today, both the Black church, the church universal, the ways in which religion has the ways that religion has, in as much as it's supposed to be liberatory, has been the stumbling block for many, that the church has been not a safe refuge for many, that leaders within religious institutions have not done the inner work, right? Many of them have failed to do the inner work or stopped along the way to do the inner work that Thurman calls us to. The ways that the hounds of hell has overtaken many individuals. I think Thurman would have a critique of these institutions. But I also think that particularly for Black religious spaces in the Black church, where Thurman, early on in his life, that institution shaped him and formed him. And he even served as a pastor of a historic Black church before going out to San Francisco. I think that he may grieve where this institution has gone, and where it is going. In as much as it's still a lifeline for many in African American communities, there are ways in which not only the Black church, but again, the Church Universal in this country has just been such a hindrance in many ways to the growth of a generation. And I think that's why we're seeing they are seeing the hypocrisy of the institutions, the hypocrisy of the leaders. They are seeing institutions not being cared for. They're seeing they've had trauma in these religious spaces. They have found that going to a religious space on Sunday or Saturday is just no longer part of their ritual and their daily lives. And I think much of that has to do with discontent. And so, yeah, I think Thurman would critique it. I think Thurman would critique the Church Universal because we are not getting to this point of higher ground, right? That this community that he's really trying to push us towards, if anything, at different points in the last 5 to 10 years. In some ways, it seems like we're going back, right? That we are still in the same place in many ways of the Church of Thurman's time, right? That we're still seeing violence enacted on Black bodies. We're still seeing people being harmed in church buildings, right? We have Charleston, right? We have individuals still being killed senselessly, right? We have Trayvon, right? That as much as stuff has changed, it's not. So I think Thurman would still more than likely, I don't know if he would have evolved in his nonviolent stance by now. I dare not even try to guess that. But if I'm using the work that Thurman has that we were left with, I would be interested to see how we would take up that mantle now more than ever in this highly politicized, highly divided society that we live in now, as it reminds us of the 1950s and 60s in the world that we lived in then. So, yeah, I don't know.
That's a tough question to answer. Yeah, as you were saying before, Howard Thurman his views of nonviolence were anything but passive. Do you think there is a new kind of activity to take, or vision, or kind of activism to take up in today's world that may not draw upon that oppressor-oppressed dynamic? Is there, or is that always with us, do you think?
I think as long as we have people, that it may always be with us, right? That as long we've had systems, right? We've always had some form of hierarchy, right? That there is, I think as long as you have humans, you're going to have a hierarchy and a system, right? That, if we're taking the words of Christ, the poor will always be among us, right? That there is, for me, this, I mean, in some ways, we put it on this eschatological hope that in the end, it will all be okay. But, as a Black American, I would love to see the kingdom come while I'm living, right? I would love to see a point where I am not marginalized because of the color of my skin. I'm not marginalized because of the way I choose to wear my hair. I'm not marginalized for just trying to be. So I am hopeful. Right. I think that's the preacher in me, is hopeful. But I also am realistic in some ways that I think our job is to ensure as individuals that we are building upon this concept for me of Thurman of higher ground. Like I'm constantly always trying to create this common ground that we can stand on and we can sit on. But until we're able to speak truth, right, and have honest conversations and do the work necessary to eradicate hate, to eradicate racism, to eradicate sexism, to eradicate xenophobia, to eradicate all these things, we find ourselves in these dichotomies and in these relationships of the oppressed and the oppressor. And so until we're able to speak truth, even at the risk of death, right? This is Thurman. Until we're able to be that bold and to speak truth to power and to call out, if I'm taking the language of Jesus, to call out these demons, right? To ask them their name, to begin to eradicate them, then we find ourselves on for me, this cyclical cycle of going backwards and forwards and making progress and falling back and making progress and falling back, until we're willing to do that radical work. And again, it's not just Christian work, it's truth work, right? It's soul work, and that's for Thurman. It starts internally, right? Until we're willing to deal with self. And the hate that lies in self and the deception that lies in self, we cannot begin to eradicate it and how it shows up in the system and in the world.
Well, we're very grateful for you coming to teach us. I think we've learned an extraordinary amount of truth and goodness and hope. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom, your experience, your years of learning with us. So very much appreciated. I think we will conclude there unless you have any closing words.
No, thank you all so much for Nathan, for having me. Thank you all for everyone who came. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I'll put my information I guess it could work in the chat. If you ever need to reach me, feel free to, put my email address in there.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Did everyone get that? Okay, that is great. And I just also want to hold up this book for all of you to read. It's only about 100 pages. It's really, it's written very, simply, elegantly, and to the point. And go out and get this as part of your library for truth and justice and deep thoughts, original thinking, derivative thinking, Christian devotion, all that stuff. Okay, well, we will, I'll keep in touch with you, Teddy, and we'll follow your career and all of the work you're doing.
Thank you so much.
We wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. And I wish you all well and have a great rest of your week.
We'll do it. Thanks.
All right. Bye.